I'm talking about the Swedish movie ANIARA today, and although this is not really about a pandemic, I think the movie is bleak enough that it actually fits this conference. ANIARA is a movie from 2018 directed by Pella Korgerman and Hugo Lilja, and it's my impression that it's really not well known and actually only came across it by coincidence. It's the first feature film by these two directors. They did uh, some short films before, and I will. What I will present now is not some like a very sophisticated theoretical paper, but more like introducing the film and then going through some aspects which I find interesting. Um, Aniara is based on an epic poem by Harry Martinson, Swedish author. It was published in 1956. The English title is Aniara, a review of man in time and space. It consists of 103 cantos, and it was only 3 years later it was turned into an opera. There was also in 1960 a Swedish TV production, which I didn't get hold of. And I have to confess, until I saw this movie, I never heard of Aniara before, and I also never heard of Harry Martinson before, but he received the Nobel Prize in 1974. And I thought it was quite amazing that I never heard of him before, because basically this is, to my knowledge, basically more or less the first science fiction writer, if you will, who received the Nobel Prize. And I would have thought that basically every history of science fiction literature would dedicate half a chapter to him, but as I said, I never encountered him. So he's really not, he didn't enter the science fiction canon. And it was now, as I said, turned into a movie 2 years ago. So what is this about? It starts with images of Earth, of a catastrophic Earth. The opening title, you see these images, which are not very clear, but we see there are all kind of catastrophes on Earth. It's never spelled out what happened, but obviously Earth has turned into inhabitable place. And that's why there are these huge ships. Their point is they transport immigrants from Earth to Mars. This is a 3-week trip, and obviously more or less whole of humanity, it's never really explained, will settle on Mars. And the ship is more or less a luxury cruise with all amenities. There are all kind of restaurants, and there are bars and shops. So this is really a very nice thing. But here is our main character. She's the so-called Mimarobe. She's responsible for the Mima. The Mima is a machine, a technology on board of this ship, and this is a kind of it takes your thoughts and emotions and your longings and then turns them into images which you experiences. So it's a kind of virtual reality device, but not really. And the interesting thing is, it shows you Earth as it once was. So you can experience Earth, undestroyed Earth. Here you see the how this looks like. This is a very strange ceiling in this Mima room. As I said, it's never explained how it works, but here you see the Mimarobe, the main character, who has not a proper name. He's just called Mimarobe, that's her function. You see her here, how she, in the Mima, walks through nature. In the beginning, there's not much interest for Mima from the passengers, because they have all other amenities, there are more interesting things to do, but then something happens. An object in space hits the ship, and this leads to disaster. They have to get rid of the engine, they have to drop it, and they also have to evade, and suddenly they're off course, and since they have dropped the engine, they cannot steer anymore. So they're off into outer space, and there's no way of turning back. Here we have the captain telling the people on board the ship, and in the beginning the official version is, we will be able to turn back in a few months, but it will take longer. But as the film goes on, it becomes clear there's no way of returning. There, off to an eternal trip into deep space. And Um, yes. And at the beginning, people don't really have a problem with it. They go on partying, everything works as before. But as the trip goes on, the situation gets more dire and people start to panic. Here we have someone who has a panic attack, and suddenly the Mima becomes much people are much more interested in Mima. Suddenly everyone wants to experience Earth again because they realize that they will never set foot on firm ground again. But Mima takes your inner thoughts, it takes your subconscious and turns into images, and it is some kind of half-living being. And with all these people coming in, and with all the aggression, with all their hate, Mima overloads. The Mima rope actually warns the captain it can handle that many people, but then it explodes, and from then on there's no Mima anymore. And the situation gets worse. People start to rebel. The captain and his crew, they have to enforce it with drastic measures, and it gets even worse. People start to commit suicide, and all kind of strange cults arise. The film is structured in chapters, and it says first chapter is hour 1, then you have day 1, and so on. And the time between the chapter gets longer and longer. So here we are at year 10. So we have a strange cults. They perform all kind of orgies. It's never really explained. There's a fertility orgy here, and the film decays. Everything falls apart. Here we are already in the year 20, and nothing works anymore. And here we are in the year 24, and as you can see, basically nothing works anymore. There's no light anymore, and we have these last human beings here huddling in the dark. This is also the point where Martinson's poem ends, but the film adds one last chapter, and this is the year 5,981,407. So after almost 10 million years, the ship arrives somewhere. It arrives in the constellation of Lyra, near Vega. And what do we see here? Almost 10 million years in the future, when no one is alive there anymore, when we have the empty ship, they arrive at the planet which looks very much Earth-like. But obviously, it's no use. Everyone's dead by then. So, what interests me about this film, first we can read ANIARA as a Generation Starship film. The motif of the Generation Starship has a long tradition in SF, and the basic idea is always we have this ship which is on this long journey, and since that's the only way to go across long distance in space without speed of light travel, and it's always the idea that they are so long on their trip that they have forgotten what's going on. They don't know they're on a ship anymore, and all kinds of strange religions arise. And this is a model. It was not the first text, but a very important text in this tradition is Robert Heinlein's Universe from 1941. We have Nonstop or Starship by Brian Aldiss, which follow this model. We have also the Book of the Long Sun cycle by Gene Wolfe, which follow this cycle. And referring to yesterday's keynote speaker, we have, of course, Kim Stanley Robinson's Aurora, which is, in a way, the Generation Starship novel to end all Generation Starship novels, because it turns the idea on its head. And for reasons which we may discuss later, this does not really exist in film. There are no really Generation Starship films, at least. If they exist, they are really not well known. And also ANIARA can be considered a Generation Starship film, but like only the beginning, or a reversed, or like an aborted Generation Starship story. This ship goes on a very long trip, but once it arrives, no one is there anymore, since it was never built to actually be a Generation Starship. And this also brings me to the next point, if we can read ANIARA as ecological SF. As I said, Earth obviously is inhabitable. It's never really explained why. This is also in Martinson's poem. There it's said that it's because of a nuclear war that it had become inhabitable, it's radiated and so on. And Martinson's poem was strongly influenced by the Cold War. He started to write it in 1956, so the year before Sputnik. The Cold War was really very intense. The fear of a nuclear war was very real, and this is something which was a strong influence there. And as I said, it's not really clear what happened in the film, but obviously there's a big ecological disaster. And Earth is only available in the simulation of Mima. And this film, and I would say here, it meets Stan Robinson's Aurora. It also makes very strongly the point that actually we cannot live without Earth. That once even the simulation of Earth in Mima is gone, the people are incapable of coping with this situation. And Robinson's point in Aurora, which he also made very explicit in various articles, was there is no planet B. So this whole idea of going out into space, that this could be a solution for our problems here, is very clearly against that, saying, okay, if we don't fix the problems here on Earth, space travel is pointless. And ANIARA in some way takes it up because, as I said, there is a planet B, but it's of no use because it's so far away. Once we arrive there, we are all dead, if that makes any sense. And finally, one aspect which interests me a lot is how ANIARA connects to the sublime. The concept of the sublime obviously has a very long history, and in the classic definition of Edmund Burke, it's called it's described as delightful horror. So we have Burke's definition and then Immanuel Kant, which are the most prominent definitions. And although there are differences between the two, which I don't want to go into them, the idea is always that we have something which is either so horrific or so huge that we cannot really comprehend it. Something which is beyond our comprehension, something which would be actually terribly frightening if we could not experience it from a safe position. So like the storm, which we can see from through the window from our warm study, or something like these huge mountains, but since we are experienced hikers, they are not so terrifying anymore. And then this horrible thing, this horrific thing turns into something delightful. Now, there's a long discussion whether this is actually something which art can achieve. I also don't want to go into that. I would say yes, it can achieve it. And one example which both Kant and Burke bring up, and which is like one of the paradigmatic examples of the sublime, is the starry sky, deep space. And that's one reason, though not the only one, why there is intimate connection between the sublime and science fiction. They are very closely related, or let's say science fiction is very good in invoking the sublime. Now, if we say the sublime is something horrific, something which is beyond comprehension, of course, space, which is huge, which is beyond everything we can imagine, which is also very dangerous, is sublime if we are in the safety of a spaceship. And in ANIARA, I would say, is really like a paradigmatic example of horrific space, because here space is not even hostile, it's just indifferent. There's a tradition of films which do this. There are not that many, but where the really horrible thing about space is it's just completely indifferent to us, and that we are human beings are of absolutely no significance. We are just these little specks somewhere in deep space. And the title of my talk is And Beyond the Infinite, which of course refers to Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. And just to end this, I want to come up with a comparison, which may be a bit forced, but still, the ending of ANIARA with this spaceship arriving at this planet, at least for me, it reminded me very much of the famous ending of 2001: A Space Odyssey. In both instances, we have Earth or a planet like Earth. We see it from space. We have an encounter between like two things, Earth and the Star Child in 2001, and the spaceship here. And for me, it was interesting to see my emotional reaction, because for me, there are people who say 2001 is also a very cold film. For me, the ending of 2001 is like cinema doesn't get much more sublime than that. And for me, that's like the most hopeful, most beautiful ending ever. And ANIARA, I would say, is really the opposite. It's really the bleakest ending imaginable. And that was something which I'm actually not sure how to conceptualize it. Stephen knows that we already discussed it on Facebook. Is there such a thing as a negative sublime, as a tragic sublime, or is it the abject? Because in ANIARA you have a form of sublime which is really the bleakest form of the sublime, where I'm not even sure whether it can still be called delightful. But this is something which we can discuss now. Thank you very much.